Are you curious about vintage and collectible watches? Have you heard of Rolex, Patek Philippe, or Audemars? Well, on today's What Do We Do podcast, we're breaking it all down with world-renowned and legendary expert Eric Wind of Wind Vintage in Palm Beach, Florida. It's going to be a great show, so hit the like button, subscribe, and let's go. Welcome back to another episode of the What Do We Do podcast. I'm your host, Dewey Steffen, and this is another guest episode. These are episodes where we bring on a leader in the community who has a story to tell, knowledge to share, and advice to give. And then we bring them on into the studio so they can drop that knowledge with all of us. Today's guest is none other than Eric Wind. Eric is known as one of the leading experts in the world on vintage watches. Eric founded and owns Wind Vintage, a company he started back in 2017 that is dedicated to offering exceptional watches and providing advisory services to top vintage watch collectors around the world. Eric has been featured and quoted in a number of publications, including GQ, The Wall Street Journal, New York Times, The New Yorker, Fortune, Men's Health, and many, many more. Eric, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Dewey.
Absolutely. I'm so fired up, and the next hour is going to fly by, my friend, okay?
Thank you.
And we're talking about vintage watches. I would call them old, maybe used, maybe, I don't know, yesterday's watches, but we're going to get into why they're so important in society and from an investment perspective, as well as just part of culture and part of the community and part of the world that we're in. Fair enough?
Yes, thank you.
All right.
Dewey.
Well, we always start our show with a game we call high-low. And Eric, for you, that is, what is the high point of your vintage watch career to this point?
I would say in September, we were honored to be nominated for this award ceremony. It was the Watch Pro Awards, which is sort of a business journal in the watch industry, Watch Pro. And we were nominated as Pre-Owned Watch Retailer of the Year, alongside eBay, who was actually sponsoring the award ceremony, Crown and Caliber, Hodinkee, Watchbox, a few other very, very large companies. You know, the Watchbox has investment from Michael Jordan, Giannis, the former owner of the Bucks, all these different people. We're a small shop, literally. We're 2.5 employees at the time, myself, my colleague Charlie Dunn, and my wife does the photography and raises our 3 kids, 2, 5, and 10. So we were literally David against Goliath, companies with thousands of employees and everything else. And we went just honored to be mentioned in the same breath as these other companies. And we actually won that night, which was a shock. And it was a very exciting moment. I would never have dreamed of something like that happening when I started Wind Vintage in 2017.
Well, that's awesome, and congratulations for that.
Thank you.
We'll maybe talk more about that as we go through the show as well.
Yeah.
Now, let's go to a low point. The low point since you started vintage watch, as your career.
I think a low point was the beginning of COVID because it was so uncertain. March 2020, people were getting concerned about what's going to happen with the watch industry. The phones went dead, email inbox, not a lot of activity. I was afraid about even a lot of our business is shipping watches out. Obviously, that's what we do every day, send watches around the country and around the world. But FedEx and UPS were saying they might not even collect signatures from people because of COVID, and then would the item be insured if you're just leaving it on someone's doorstep? Then can I even ship the watch? But the broader question, are people actually going to buy watches, or what's the heck's going to happen to the watch industry? About a month later in April, the phone started ringing again, emails. People were at home and bored, and then the watch industry just took off from there. It was really insane over the coming months, and thankfully the watch industry was unaffected, but it was a scary few weeks, honestly.
So it went from maybe a low to also like a different type of high.
Yeah, like,
right?
wow, this is, people are bored and they're spending serious money on watches. It was a few months later, I sold my first watch for over $1 million, vintage Rolex Daytona that new in 1969 cost about $200 in Sweden, and sold it for about 1.3 million US dollars. So it was pretty incredible, and that might not have happened except for COVID and people being bored and the watch industry really kicking off at that time.
Now, to have that watch, did you have that in inventory that you had already
I
purchased?
didn't at that time, but then, about a month or two later, then I started talking to the owner who had purchased it when I was at Christie's through private sale. And then he was, people began, because they were sitting at home and no one was traveling, people began thinking about their hobbies and watches and should I buy, should I sell? And thankfully he wanted to sell, and I sold it. So it was very good.
Yeah, that's awesome. And we're going to talk about that as one of the topics is online purchasing of watches or selling and all those types of things. But before we do that and look at all these amazing vintage watches that you brought for our audience to see, and we'll probably talk about a few of them throughout the show. Yeah. But let's give a little bit more about your background. I gave a very brief introduction, but certainly you have an expertise in this field that is not only, according to your friend Tom, give you one of the best in the United States, but Tom would say in the world. You are the premier person of knowledge in vintage watches. Tom, that's for you. And but with that, so please give our audience your background a little bit.
So I'm from Wisconsin originally. I'm from Manitowoc. We have the Badger car ferry that goes to Ludington. So I took that a few times growing up. Would spend some summer vacations on Mackinac Island and in the Upper Peninsula, or the UP as we call it. Also, occasionally came over to Detroit, and I'm very proud to have grown up in the Midwest and have those kind of values of being friendly and honest and all those sorts of things. So that's kind of my early stage background. I went to Georgetown. I studied international politics. I was always interested in the world and was very interested in the Middle East, particularly post 9/11, which that happened when I was in junior high school. So wanted to see and to learn more and try to be helpful if I could. So I studied international politics. Then I got a job with a small consulting firm in Washington, D.C. for a few years. I realized I didn't know a lot about business because I focused so heavily on government and politics. So I decided to apply to do an MBA and went to Oxford. I met my current wife, Christine. We were both young professionals in DC, got married, moved to England. So that was a fun first year of marriage. But during that time, I was writing about watches post Georgetown. My first vintage watch was a Hamilton. That was a gift from my grandmother to my grandfather in 1947 for their wedding in Illinois. And that was my grandfather's kind of daily watch. I remember him wearing it on a gold stretch bracelet that pulls your hair off your wrist, the old Speidel Twist-to-Flex bracelets. And after he passed, my mom gave it to me, and that was my first vintage watch. And I was kind of just amazed by winding it up every day and looking at the movement and all the intricacies of it. Particularly for our generation, everything around us is pretty disposable. And to see something like that should last hundreds of years is sort of unusual. And then I came across this site called Hodinkee in its early days that was exclusively about vintage watches at the beginning, and I just couldn't get enough reading about vintage watches. So then basically that led into me writing for Hodinkee. Did that for years as a kind of a side hustle, if you will, just a passion project. Then I got recruited to go to Christie's as vice president, senior specialist of watches for the New York team. And then
how old were you at that time? Like I don't know. How old were you?
Yeah. I was just around 30 years old when I joined Christie's. And that was a really fun experience. That's allowed me to start Win Vintage, no question. Just meeting all the top collectors around the world, getting to handle and sell so many great watches across all different brands, from everything from old pocket watches, hundreds of years old, to very high-end Patek Philippe watches for millions of dollars. And then I had clients who really wanted my help and expertise, but within the Christie's construct, I had no time to help them. I was really just trying to source watches for auction and then sell them. So it became clear I should kind of take a leap of faith and start my own business. And I did that, and the rest is history.
The rest is history. 2017.
Yeah, exactly.
Who would have been one of your mentors? Again, you can't just read online and study, other blogs about vintage watches, but who, kind of mentored you or kind of gave you the education that was not in the textbook?
Yeah, there were a few. Ben Clymer, who started Hodinkee, we both were kind of coming up together, and he was learning a lot. I was learning a lot from him, and as I learned stuff, I shared it with him. He started Hodinkee, and that has been a very successful company. They had investment from Tom Brady and John Mayer and others. So that was really special. John Reardon recruited me to go to Christie's. He's really a Patek Philippe expert. And was head of watches when I was at Christie's. So he taught me a lot. I had collectors who taught me a lot. Guys like Jeffrey Binstock, who's a collector in New York. Eric Tortella is kind of a Patek Philippe expert and just general watch expert in Greece. I've learned a lot from him about restoration and all the details of how these watches were kind of treated during service by Patek Philippe, Rolex, et cetera, and how they were made in the first place. So you also could go to kind of specific experts on different brands, like Fred Mandelbaum is an expert on Breitling, their watches, their history. Jeff Stein is he's a lawyer in Atlanta. He taught me so much about Hoyer and has the preeminent site about that. So everyone kind of tries to share their knowledge, which is why it's a really cool community of people.
That's awesome. On that note, is it tomato? Is it Patek or Patek?
You can,
what do you go with?
You can say either one, Patek Philippe or Patek Philippe. It seems like the Stern family that owns it, they've been pushing the Patek Philippe now as the pronunciation. In the past, it sounded like they were saying Patek Philippe, honestly, if you look at old YouTube videos. But Patek is kind of how most people say it now.
Okay.
And you can, there's many other, you hear Patek, you hear all kinds of different, that was actually a Polish name originally, so people have opinions about how that should be pronounced, basically. But you could say Patek or Patek.
I've heard people call it a Philippe Patek.
Yeah, that's not right.
Right?
That's not right. That's the only thing I can tell you is that's not correct.
That's not a tomato or a tomato.
No.
All right, that's fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about vintage watches, the industry, or just what they are. Mm-hmm. What makes a watch vintage?
Technically, the term vintage comes from wine and kind of refers to wine 20 years old and beyond. For the world of vintage watches, people often kind of think 1980s and older, but that goalpost is kind of moving as time goes on. So there's a whole category of kind of neo-vintage watches from the 1990s, early 2000s, and independents that are kind of independent watch brands. Those watches from the 1990s, when it was kind of taking off, are kind of considered vintage. So whether it's F.P. Journe or Frank Muller or these other companies. So you could kind of say it's 1990s and older. And in the construct of Rolex, they got rid of the acrylic crystals that are plastic, kind of plexiglass crystals, around 1990. So a lot of people also feel like those watches that had those older plastic crystals that are frequently domed, a little bit different architecture, those are kind of vintage and older, but it's somewhere in that range, whether 80s, 90s.
Would there be a reason why, as a watch expert, or in this case, a vintage watch expert, you're just not a watch expert, and why just vintage and 1980s and before? Rolex, Patek brings new ones out this year.
Yeah.
So you don't even look at them?
No, I look at them, and honestly, it's a huge portion of my business is modern pre-owned watches. It seems like it's about half my business. So, I pay close attention. I help people sell modern watches, even watches that are 2 or 3 days old. I sometimes have in my hands and am selling for people that want to realize gains of the purchase retail price versus the secondary market price could be higher. They're trying to turn it into a vintage watch or something else. So I guess I shouldn't limit myself to saying vintage watch expert, but I focus on all watches essentially.
Well, as we were introduced, and I was introduced to you as being a vintage watch expert,
Yeah.
I kind of was, again, confused what that meant versus pre-owned. Like, to me, anything that is 1 day old or bought and then taken delivery of, that's considered, whether it's used or pre-owned.
Yeah, exactly.
And so with cars, let's say expensive cars, the minute you drive it off the lot, it loses half of its value, and it's pre-owned. And so, again, sophisticated buyers don't buy it brand new on the lot. They wait until it's vintage or pre-owned or whatever.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
Does it kind of work the same way with watches?
The interesting thing, similar to cars the last few years, particularly certain models and things like that were worth a lot more on the secondary for cars, it's similar to watches. So, a Rolex Daytona that in the store is $14,000 in steel, if you could buy it, at its peak, it was worth $50,000 when you walk out the door. So it's no surprise people would try to buy it and then flip it and make, $35,000 kind of thing. It's similar with Patek Philippe Nautilus, Patek Philippe Aquanauts, these sport models that were selling for a huge premium on the secondary market versus retail. Kind of the quintessential example of watch at retail going crazy on the secondary market is the Nautilus. That was the final 5711/1A with a Tiffany blue dial that says Tiffany & Co. on it. They made 170 of them, and the first one went at auction and sold for $6 million, and retail was $52,000. Obviously, the value came down as more hit the secondary, but it's still north of $1 million versus a $52,000 retail price if you were lucky enough to get one. Obviously, you couldn't walk in the store and just buy it without having some sort of relationship with Tiffany & Company or being a celebrity like Leonardo DiCaprio or Mark Wahlberg or LeBron James, Tommy Hilfiger, different kind of famous people.
So we're going to talk about that again. The watch is supposed to be utility. It's supposed to tell time. Okay, and maybe it's a fashion accessory and goes with your outfits. I do always match my watches to some part of the outfit that I'm wearing that day for sure. But as an investment, if something is $50,000 to over $1 million or $2,000 to $50,000, from our show, What Do We Do, the podcast, and our parent company, Great Lakes Wealth, as an investment vehicle, we would put in the category of alternative investments, but certainly with wine, art, anything that is an alternative investment. So when you're talking watches, what are we looking for? What makes a vintage watch better than a brand new Apple iWatch or the Timex at the dollar store?
Yeah, so there's a lot of craftsmanship that go into these watches. Some watches from independent watchmakers, they might make 5 or 6 per year. So they're literally spending 2 months making all the attributes of the watch, finishing the movement by hand, all that sort of stuff. So, and traditionally it was kind of price was a reflection of the time invested and the materials. Obviously, if a watch was gold versus being made in steel, it was significantly more expensive, or platinum, or different materials like that. Now there's obviously a huge amount of marketing that goes into it. The technology, the factories, the employees, the machines, if there's robots, all kinds of different stuff, like how much you pay your watchmakers versus how much time they have to put into making it. So it's a lot of different things that go into the kind of final price, but it also is just what the market's willing to bear. So if you have a super desirable watch, you can kind of put a much higher value as the retail price, and brands aren't stupid. They realize that and try to maximize how much they can extract from the customer.
So it's similar to whether it's cars or anything else of quality. It's supposed to last. It could be a luxury item. But again, I don't know, let's talk Rolex for a second. I'm sure there's a starter level for Rolex, and I'm sure there's the big baller, maybe even a custom Rolex you could have made. So again, versus just going to, I don't know, the store down the street for a $25 watch that tells time, to a $300 watch, to a $3,000, to a $30,000. Like what, again, ultimately, what's the difference and what makes the opportunity there?
So essentially, as you said, you could go down the street and get a $25 watch or $10 watch at Walmart, sort of thing. Those are all battery powered, so they have those small batteries on the inside. They should last a long time, but they won't last forever. Eventually the movement's going to wear out, or the battery's going to leak, or all these issues. Funnily enough, when the battery technology first came into watches, or quartz technology, in the sort of 1969, the Japanese came out with the first quartz watch. Prior to that, there were also battery-powered watches, but they were called electric and kind of more primitive. But the first quartz watch in 1969 came from Seiko, and those cost like the price of a Honda Accord or something crazy. They were made in all gold, and they were super accurate. So one of the kind of paradoxes of the world of collecting is that that $10 watch you buy is more accurate than the most expensive Rolex you can buy, essentially, which is mechanical. It's got, 100, 200 plus parts in it, depending on the watch. And it's at best, maybe 2 seconds off per day, but you can get a quartz watch that should be less than a second off per day, fraction of a second. So it's really not about accuracy. In the past, it was about accuracy. 70 years ago, it was all about accuracy and trying to make watches as accurate as possible. Now it's more about the craftsmanship, the luxury, the materials, all that, the bracelet, how that's constructed, if it has a steel bracelet versus a leather strap or alligator strap, crocodile, etc. So, that's one of the things that is different, but a great mechanical watch should literally last 500 years plus. There's no way your Apple Watch is going to last that long, or even last 50 years in reality. These watches are really built to last like few other things in our lives today.
Yeah, that's something that I knew that we just don't talk about in society very much, a mechanical watch, meaning that it doesn't have a battery. I mean, everyone kind of knows that you got to twist your watch and wind your watch.
Exactly.
But and I have a few mechanical watches, and so I know when I put them away and I don't pull them out for a while, again, you just have to wind them, and then they start. You got to reset the time.
Exactly.
It's kind of cool. It's actually kind of a cool thing. I'm going to put this on and get it going again. But for me, growing up, it was the Swatch watch.
Yes.
Right. That was the big, and maybe that was just a brand, and to branding to novelty.
It was
item.
Brilliant. Yeah.
And then Timex was the same thing. And is Timex even still around today?
They're still around and still very successful.
And they have vintage watches. So you market those, you sell those as well.
I don't sell vintage Timex. Those could be $20, $10, or $100 or $200 or whatever. There's not a huge market for those, because they were not made with the same standard. It was really a mass-produced watch, but cool nonetheless.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to go off script here for a minute.
Yeah.
I'm going to put you on the spot. So a lot of our audience are Gen Zs, millennials. We call them Zoomers. Okay, and so for all of the Zoomers out there, if you have $1,000 to go towards whether it's a vintage watch or a modern pre-owned watch, what would you put $1,000 to a purchase in today, and then a $5,000 purchase today?
So for $1,000, it kind of depends on your various factors. Like, do you want like something that has phone calls, like an Apple Watch? Do you want messages, all that sort of stuff? I wouldn't discourage you from getting an Apple Watch if that's what you want, or, things that are smartwatches, etc. But I personally don't like having a smartwatch on. I prefer kind of the traditional watches, obviously, otherwise I'd be in the wrong field. If this is going to be kind of your one watch to do everything with, I honestly would not necessarily recommend a vintage watch. Most of the vintage watches in that price point are not going to be water resistant. It's going to maybe need $1,000 to $2,000 service every 5 to 10 years, which you're not going to want to spend, because the watch is still worth $1,000 after you spend another $1,000 on it. So it's really got to be a passion collecting thing. I would maybe recommend some of the collaboration watches I've designed. I helped design these watches for Seiko with Rowing Blazers, which is a company I'm an investor in, and they're really fun, colorful watches. You can go in the water with them. They retailed for $500. It's got a great bracelet. You can kind of do anything with that, and that might be a better sort of first watch for someone. It's automatic, so it winds with the movement of your wrist, and you can really beat it up without concern, and servicing it probably would be extremely inexpensive or won't be needed for 10 plus years.
Okay, and then let's go 5,000. So let's say, again, maybe the vintage, again, we'll talk maybe as an investment. Again, those are a starting point. And then maybe we'll talk about that. What is the starting point for a vintage watch?
I sell vintage watches as kind of inexpensive as $400 or $500 on my site. I try not to focus on that area because I wouldn't have a business if that's what I did. But I find really cool watches and might put them up for sale. For $5,000, you could get that's a great point where you can get a more water resistant watch, which is really vintage Rolex, like a vintage Rolex, 6426, which is a manual wind piece. That's 34 millimeters. It can be kind of a sport watch, but also just a watch you can do anywhere. Vintage Rolex Datejusts, that could be $5,000 to $7,000. You can, again, there could be water resistant to kind of 165 feet or deeper with fresh gaskets, so you really can do anything with it and not worry. The only thing is these older watches have acrylic crystals typically, as I mentioned before, and if you hit it, you can scratch it and everything else. They can get kind of buffed or polished, or if it gets cracked, you have to replace it. That might be $200 to $300. But that's the only thing. You can't like completely just beat the watch to heck because of that crystal issue. But otherwise, they're really super, super great watches.
Okay. It seems to me that there's your everyday watch, and maybe that's not a vintage watch.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the $200 watch. I don't even know what it would be, but
and you could have a vintage watch as an everyday watch. Like it just depends on your lifestyle. Like for my wife, she's grabbing kids out of showers and baths and everything else, so she really needs a vintage Rolex because we've made kind of 70-year-old plus Rolex watches still water resistant. Our watchmaker with fresh gaskets and making sure the crowns and tubes are in good condition where you wind the time. You can't really do that with anything else. So vintage Rolex is a great everyday watch. You can have a vintage Patek Philippe as an everyday watch, but you probably don't want to be grabbing kids out of the shower or bath or things like that. So it really just depends on lifestyle a little bit.
Okay, that's fair. What else should we talk about out of the gate? Let's go with maybe as an investment. We talked about, again, your everyday watch, that's your utility.
Yeah.
Maybe it's worth $5,000, maybe it's worth $50,000. We can get different price points.
Yeah.
But if it's your everyday watch, it's for utility. It maybe just has the durability.
Yeah.
But then as an investment, should you even buy a watch as an investment? Your clients, do they buy them because they want to, have an investment and put it in the lockbox or put it away, or are they flipping them as well? Or no, these are these are like grandma's diamonds that come out when you go to the Oscars.
Yeah, exactly. I think for a lot of my clients, they consider it an investment. It's something where they care about the values. They're not going to go crazy. These things go up or down. It's not 100% of their wealth tied in their watch collections, but it is a significant percentage of their wealth, and they obviously don't want to see it decrease by 50%. They also would love to see it increase if possible. I've seen certain watches skyrocket from $2,000 to $50,000 in 2 or 3 years, but it's almost too fast of growth, and then it comes back and maybe it's $25,000. I talked about this to the Horological Society of New York, which I gave 2 lectures to, kind of profiled some of those case studies. But, I think it's something that people do consider an investment. Certainly for myself and the watches in my own collection, it's both passion and investment. So I talk about the scale that I created. Some people are kind of 99% investment and 1% passion. They're really just trying to time the market. And in the last 2 years, for instance, vintage Cartier watches have gotten extremely popular. and in some cases have gone up 10x. The values. Some people were trying to time that or manipulate the market. There's nothing illegal in manipulating the vintage watch market to buy up a bunch of a watch and then put it at auction and bid it up, or try to get people to write about the watch. There's a lot of people trying to push their own watch collection values by telling people to write about it or cover it or sell it or post it on Instagram, etc. So you've got to just be aware of kind of all of these factors in the world of watch values.
Is it a situation where the watch manufacturers, that again, Switzerland comes to mind, Swiss watches, right?
They're almost all Swiss.
Do they have brand new watches coming out, whether it's Patek Philippe or whoever else? So they want to sell this year's model, but they also do they want a secondary market for the vintage ones to sell for $100,000 and they came out at $20,000? I mean, what kind of business model are they looking for?
I think it's complicated with the watch manufacturers because obviously their primary concern are sales and profit and revenue for this year. Right now, a bunch of the watch brands are part of Swatch Group, which is publicly traded. Other brands are part of Richemont, which there's a public element. Everyone is thinking about values for the groups, and a lot of the watch brands we know fall into different kind of luxury groups. So Swatch Group started with Swatch, the kind of fashion $100 watches, which are still super popular, and the Moon Swatch has been crazy the last 2 years. Which was kind of a Omega Swatch collaboration, but they bought basically during the quartz crisis, all these Swiss watch brands were going out of business, and they bought Omega, which was huge, obviously, Breguet, all these other brands, Jacques Dro, Hamilton, they brought over to Switzerland from the United States in 1969, a bunch of other companies. Then you've got Richemont, which is Cartier, Vacheron Constantin, a bunch of great brands there. And then you've got LVMH, which is Tag Heuer, Bulgari, Hublot. So there's a lot of, it's not just the brand, it's about the whole company behind it, which includes other fashion brands. So a lot of these brands don't even understand their own history. Honestly, they also don't want the vintage watches surpassing the values necessarily of the new watches because they're trying to focus on new, but they still want vintage to help promote their new. So it's kind of this complicated, tug of war, if you will, between vintage and modern. But no question what happens with new watches can affect values of vintage watches and help them go up, and vice versa. If the vintage watches get hot, then the watch brand tries to make new watches that look like the vintage watches, which are popular, which some cases hurts the vintage watches because essentially they've created a one-to-one replica of it, and then there's no differentiation between the brand new and the vintage if they look the same.
And even if they didn't make it look similar, if the vintage spikes in value, then can they just reprice the new one? Let's say the vintage goes from $10,000 to $20,000, whatever they were going to have the new one at $15,000, they can maybe make it $25,000 with it.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Piaget is kind of a famous jewelry company, but they also make watches, and they had this watch that came out in 1979 called the Polo, which is kind of this distinctive gold watch, very 80s style. It was getting very popular the last couple of years, and values were going up, and then they just reintroduced it now. But the watches were maybe $10,000 to $15,000. The vintage Polos, they just made a new one that's $73,000, to which everyone's going crazy. Like, how could you price it that high? Maybe you'd say $40,000 or something, but it's been a big, hullabaloo the last few weeks about that.
There's always something going on.
Yeah, exactly.
So right now I'm going to have you just tell our audience where they can learn more about you, your company, get some quick history on YouTube or the internet about Eric Wind and Wind Vintage.
Yeah, so our website's windvintage.com. That's the homepage is essentially what we currently have for sale. We're always adding almost every single day more watches for sale and selling watches. So there's a lot of movement and activity. There's an about page. You can read about me there. The best kind of primer about watches, and I know you watched some of it, was on the Horological Society of New York, their YouTube channel. I gave kind of 2 almost 1.5-hour talks each about collecting vintage watches. So that's really going to save you several years of just digging around to learn about watches. It'll give you a kind of a framework to understand vintage watches, and that was my goal with that. A lot of people come into vintage watches and get ripped off. Like I've seen people lose $10 million plus buying the wrong watches from the wrong people. So that's one thing that I wanted to convey in this talk is you can't just walk into a random store and drop, $500,000 on vintage watches and think they're worth what you're spending. Because I see stuff in stores listed for 40,000 that the reality is it's worth no more than 8,000, sort of thing. You had a kind of a similar experience with the diamond you bought that you thought you were getting a good deal on it, and you learned it wasn't such a great deal after some amount of time.
Yeah, I think I'll tell that story real quick. Before we came on air, I was sharing that in my prior life I bought a diamond ring. And I paid a discount. I believe that it retailed for, let's say, 25,000. We'll use a number, and that would be retail. So Dewey, you can buy it for 17,000. That would be wholesale. And if you pay cash, we don't have to do credit card transactions. We'll do it for 14,000. So I'm just kind of making the numbers up here. But then the first question I had to the jeweler at the time was, what do I insure it for? Do I insure it for the 25,000 so that if it is lost or stolen or whatever, I have to go buy one at retail, and this would be for your house as well, and anything of value, the replacement cost. And then it's the wholesale because I can whatever. So that's its own analysis we won't talk about today. But ultimately, we went to sell that diamond, or that diamond went to be sold, and the appraised value, like the high end across the market, wasn't just from one place and one person, but was like 8,000. Yeah. And I said, no, time out. Like these are supposed to go up in value. Like this, like diamond rings, ladies, for those for those wedding rings. Like if it's 10,000 now, you would want it to be worth 30,000 later, or 50,000, or grandma's diamond. So in that case, is that was I fleeced in the front end? Do the markets change? And then ultimately, is that the same with watches?
Yeah, I can't say in that instance. I'm not a gemologist, fortunately or unfortunately, but certainly I've learned just to invest in things I know, because when I've tried to get involved in other worlds, like not in any crazy amount, but you learn quickly that you don't know that much, whether it's cars or art or wine or anything. So I try to stick to my knitting, as I was told when I was younger, stick to what I know. In the world of watches, certainly some things have gone way up in value. Some people, unfortunately, have purchased some of these hype watches, like Audemars Piguet Royal Oaks, that got super hot during the pandemic the last couple of years.
Is that Drake? I think Drake wore that and showed that off in some videos. Yeah.
They just did a Travis Scott one. But some of these watches were trading for north of $250,000 that are now under $100,000 2 years later. So people that bought them at these inflated values were not happy. I think that similar things happened with Lamborghinis, is my understanding. A lot of other G-Wagons, some of these things that were trading at super inflated values, kind of on the secondary market versus retail. Everything's kind of dropped back more to reality. It happens with vintage watches. Certain things get super hot and then they cool off, and then hopefully they reignite again. But trends change. Back in the 1990s, people liked these Rolex watches called bubblebacks, which are 32 millimeter, very small watches. They got super popular in Japan and Asia, things like that, and it was all anyone wanted. And then as time went on, it was honestly kind of small for Western tastes, corn-fed Midwestern boys like you and me. And wearing a tiny little watch was maybe not aspirational. So the values just kind of plummeted, and they're just probably never going to be back at the values they were in the 1990s. There are certain exceptional ones that are kind of worth more than others. But the best advice I can give someone for collecting is to collect the best possible example, which is condition, 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 as original as possible.
That's, by the way, one of your slides in the talk you gave. Condition, condition.
Yeah,
condition.
exactly. Instead of rarity, back in the day, people were looking for very rare, but maybe the condition was lacking. And that's really changed a lot, I would say, the last decade. It's about the best possible example of something more ordinary. If you have the nicest one on the planet, and that's kind of across collecting fields, whether it's baseball cards or comic books or coins, stamps, watches, like if you have the best, the odds are that will kind of outperform the rest, because there's a lot of any given item in the world, but a lot of people will want the best example of it.
What about the whole package, the box, the papers, the receipt? I mean, I don't know where it goes, but part of the talk that you gave, as well as just common sense. I have bought pre-owned watches before, and I gravitate to if it has the box and has those things, but ultimately that box just ends up in my closet, and I don't keep the watch in the box. So, but does that make a difference? Am I just overpaying, or what's the story?
For modern watches, there's sort of a strong expectation that they'll still have the box and papers from the last 20 years, and there'll be a severe discount if they don't. But with vintage, the odds are that your 1960s, 1970s Rolex watch will not have the original box and papers. Now, the market kind of adds 25% to the value of the watch if it has the box and papers. And as a result, there were a number of bad actors who would basically buy boxes, unfilled papers, and kind of assemble the set. There was one guy on eBay, they tracked that he made 400 or 500 sets just from what they could track, because they were tracking what he was buying. So the watch only, back in the day, you could see what people were buying. And then lo and behold, 2 months later, it's up for sale with the box and papers magically appearing. So you need to be aware that probably half of the vintage Rolex watches that have box and papers are not original to the watch, so you shouldn't really value it that much higher. I always say focus on the watch condition first. If that matches and there's good provenance and it has box and papers, that's kind of the cherry on top of the ice cream sundae.
But for all of our watchers, all of our listeners out there tuning in today, any new watches or any modern pre-owned watches?
It's generally better to have. It's very hard to sell them without. We occasionally get a watch without box and papers. Someone lost it. I've seen it happen where something got damaged in a hurricane and thrown away in Florida.
When you mean papers, what does that mean?
It's usually for modern Rolex, it's like a little card that has the serial number. With Patek Philippe, it's like it's called the certificate of origin. It folds out, kind of tri-fold, almost piece of 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. So that's kind of the papers. It has to have the serial number of the watch, which the serial number might be on the movement or on the case or both, and have that reflected on the papers along with maybe when it was purchased. That sort of information.
Similar to when celebrities autograph something, now it has to have the hologram and authenticity of the signature, right?
So different.
That's crazy. Yeah. I think the camera can get to kind of maybe real quick without messing up, but maybe briefly, I don't know, talk about all this wealth on this table.
Yeah. So I brought one watch I actually purchased from the original owner in Ann Arbor. I flew to Ann Arbor and paid this gentleman for the watch, which he got as a college graduation gift in 1983 from the University of Michigan. And he realized it had basically become a 6-figure watch and decided to sell it. And it was too nice for him to wear every day. He felt like it was just sitting in the box. It wasn't doing him any good. And he could use the funds for some home renovations he wanted to do. So this is a very cool vintage Rolex Daytona reference 6263, known as the Big Red, and just a very solid watch.
Very cool. I'll take this one. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
And then all of these are for sale.
They're all
from your store. Is that right?
Yes, everything from.
It's light. This is surprisingly light.
Yeah, lighter than in the past. This is Abercrombie and Fitch Seafarer. So back when Abercrombie was kind of the premier outdoor goods outfitter, it matches your shirt very well.
Hey, look at that.
That's perfect. But that was actually designed to show high and low tide each day, so people could kind of make their decisions related to fishing and hunting and boating based on that watch.
Are these all men's watches except for that maybe that gold one at the end, or is that a men's watch as well? Or
that's
they're unisex? The watches go unisex?
They kind of are, but they're all men's watches really, in that a lot of women do like to wear kind of a sportier watch though. Like my wife wears a Daytona. That's sort of a very versatile, nice watch on a woman as well.
Okay, let's talk about which one on this table is the most expensive available for purchase, and why.
Yeah, it's that Daytona actually.
Okay.
We're asking $110,000 for it.
Okay, I'll take that one.
Yeah, exactly. It's appropriate for you. But yeah, everything from a gold Submariner that's $35,000 to Datejust that's $6,900 to a very cool Jaeger LeCoultre for $1,900.
Do you, in the industry, is there negotiations? Can you do, I don't know, bartering is the right word, but can you, is it firm, the prices are firm, or how does that go?
There can be some negotiation. It really depends on the watch. There's a whole TikTok kind of thing of people watching bartering on 47th Street, the Diamond District in New York. And it's the problem with that is it's really not about the watch. It's just about the negotiation. They could care less about the watch, honestly. So we don't, I had someone recently offer me $1,750 for a watch I had listed for $4,900. I was like, dude, I've already been offered $4,000 and said no. You can't just be ridiculous with what you offer. But
like I was saying before we went on air, we should have a BOGO, buy one, get one.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, like
they
do at the restaurants.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, well, we're going to pivot to a part of the show, which is my favorite part of the show, Eric. And instead of this being what do we do for the next few minutes, it's going to be what Eric do. Okay, and this is a part of the show where I'd like you to tell our audience what you would go back and tell your 18-year-old self or others 18-year-old out there today to live their best life.
Yeah, I think I would tell myself not to overdo it, not to spread yourself so thin. Just stay focused, enjoy your life. I did a lot of different clubs and activities from kind of high school, college, and then even with Win Vintage, I've pivoted away from selling a lot of the under $10,000 watches because you end up spending 80% of your time on that, the kind of the 80-20 rule, but it leads to like less than 20% of your profit. So, I think trying to be more balanced and enjoy your life. Like I love to play golf, but I think last year I played 2 or 3 rounds the entire year because I was so busy. And I'm trying to just say, okay, I've got to enjoy my life a little bit here and not kill myself. I'm still under 40. I've got 3 kids, 2, 5, and 10. And, I just realized you've got to enjoy your life. So that's what I would say.
Well, fantastic. Appreciate that very much. Yeah. And for all of the listeners out there in Podcast Nation or watchers out there in YouTube land, the 80-20 rule is also known as the Pareto principle.
Yeah.
Okay. And again, check that out, look it up, understand that. And that basically says that 80% of your profitable activities, your best activities come from 20% of what you're actually doing, and you waste 80% of your time for the other 20%. It's kind of backwards. So really focus and be dialed in.
Yeah,
no pun intended.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, we have a few minutes left, but let's talk about, I guess, what's next for you in this journey besides managing your time. And again, my children are a little bit older. We talked about that a teeny bit, but earlier off camera. But enjoy the time with your children for sure. Time does fly by, and be balanced. But with Wind Vintage opening in 2017, making it through COVID and not just surviving, but then thriving.
Yeah.
And now with where we are, and again, the hot market of vintage watches, you could go the other way. You could just lever up. You could get 10, 20 employees, go borrow 100 million from some private investors and go take over the world. So let's talk about that after the show, okay? But until then, like, what's next for you and your business and your personal life?
I think it's just continuing to have good growth as a company, continue to serve our customers. We've done some retail partnerships, so I have some vintage watches for sale at Kith, which is a great company. I have some watches in their store in Brooklyn, Miami Design District, Beverly Hills. I work with Mr. Porter and Net-a-Porter, which they have a fantastic audience of clients for their high-end clothing, and it's nice to offer them vintage and pre-owned watches and educate them. But, we also are dabbling with doing more in the media space. I've done different YouTube videos in the past with the Horological Society of New York, with Hodinkee and others. A lot of people have invested super heavily in YouTube, TikTok, that sort of thing. I haven't had time, honestly, but maybe doing a few things that really just continue to advance the scholarship and enjoyment of the hobby. It's like you can't just extract everything from the hobby. I've always tried to give back, like I'm speaking at the Detroit Athletic Club. Is that really going to help my business? I don't know, but I'm hoping it'll just continue to spread the gospel of vintage watches and about watches generally, so people, when they get involved in watches, make the right decisions. Because I've seen people lose millions of dollars, as I've told you, from buying from the wrong people, the wrong watches, the wrong places. And those people just leave the hobby forever. So it's a huge negative. I'm always trying to give back and trying to promote watches and vintage watches and scholarship and knowledge. So try to continue to do that.
Well, we're going to touch on educating our listeners and our viewers again about whether they have to go to your website and buy from you, or can they go to watches.com or wherever they can go in their neighborhood. So we'll talk about it in just a second.
Yeah.
Before we do that, in one of the articles I read, you mentioned about the dying art of managing the insides of the watches, being the watchmaker, the repair person, if that's your avocation, that it's a dying art. So talk about maybe the field of maintaining the watches.
I have told my nephews and others that watchmaking is a very good field. You're not going to become a billionaire in all likelihood, but I know watchmakers that make $400,000 or $500,000 a year, and they can just be their own boss, operate in their own, sometimes in their home, in an office, whatever, charge $1,000 to $2,000 per watch, or maybe do that 200, 250 times a year, and you've got a really good business and income. There's obviously some costs. Watchmaking bench might be $4,000. Sort of, some of these tools are expensive, but you're prorating it over, it might last you 20 or 30 years, so it's not that crazy. It's a great field. We need more of them. As more and more watches are made, there's just more and more demand for them to be serviced every 5 years, kind of average or more, depending on the watch. And it's really, really a critically important field.
Are there trade schools or anything like that, in the United States, or again, does everything go back to Switzerland?
No, there's various schools in the United States and Pennsylvania and other places. You pretty much, as long as you can pass and have an aptitude for it, have a guaranteed job right after that probably pays you, $80K plus, and you don't even have to have a college degree. You just could get that degree from that trade school. It's a great opportunity for people. Really fantastic line of work, as long as you have the patience for it and aptitude. And honestly, you need to have good skills with your hands and with managing kind of fine motor skills. But if you have that, it's a great field.
You have to have small fingers.
Yeah, not necessarily, but you got to be able to manipulate the tools at least.
No question. Question. All right, so let's go back to the buying of the watches. Let's educate our listeners and our viewers today. if anyone needs to go one place, like to either get educated besides going to YouTube to Eric Wynn's talk at the Horological Society of New York, I would recommend that for sure and check that out. But whether it's, again, to get the deals or to understand, do you have to engage and hire you to, to appraise it or to review it? And we haven't talked about selling these things back yet, but can you just go to the eBay and it's fair market that way?
It's the Wild West. So I sometimes joke I don't want to sell someone their first vintage watch necessarily. Of course, I'm happy to, and it's worked out in many cases fine. But you deal with people not knowing, for instance, that this old Rolex Daytona needs to be wound every day. And I sold a watch to a famous athlete that was kind of a dream watch for him, 6-figure piece. And then he's saying it's not keeping time, not working well. And I said, it's funny, it was working fine when I had it, but okay, I'll take it back. I sent him a label, got the watch back, had it serviced for, almost $2,000, send it back. It's still not keeping time. I said, that's impossible. I know it's fine. Like, literally, it's fine. Then it turns out he didn't know it needed to be wound fully every day. This was not an automatic watch. So that was kind of a funny thing. But you run into these little things, or people not knowing how to treat their watches. You can't just bang it around on door jambs and throw it around or wear it in the water if it's not water resistant or that sort of stuff. It'll get literally destroyed. You have to treat them a certain way. It's not the same as like buying a Apple Watch or a brand new watch. But that's kind of one thing to be aware of. The other is, and I talk about this to HSNY, that one watch could be worth $500,000 with all authentic original parts in brand new condition from 1958. And the same watch could just come back from Rolex for service and be worth $8,000 because Rolex replaced the dial, the hands, the bezel insert, all these different things. They're all authentic, but collectors don't want it. And someone unscrupulous could sell you that $8,000 watch, like I said, for $50,000. I've seen that in vintage watch stores, on eBay, all different places. So there's no crime against someone overcharging you, unfortunately. For authentic parts, it would be a crime if it's fake parts. But honestly, even lawsuits I've seen involving fakes and that sort of stuff, it's very hard for the judge to make a determination about who's correct. And what's real and what's fake, the judge doesn't know. So I've seen cases where people that bought fake watches lost the case because they weren't able to prove their case in court. So, that's all very important to know. You've got to buy from a trusted dealer. My colleague, Charlie Dunn, who works with me, has told people you don't come to Win Vintage to buy your first vintage watch. You come to Win Vintage to buy your last. Like, this is where you keep the collecting journey and you just know you're in good hands, sort of thing. Not to speak so much about myself, but there's other trusted dealers out there, but it is really the Wild West.
Well, on that note, that might be a good place to wrap up today, Eric. It is the Wild West, but go find a good sheriff. Right?
I like that. I like that.
There you go.
Thank you.
Before we do wrap up and say goodbye, how about you just let our audience know anything else on your mind, anything you want to share, to your kids later on when they see this 10, 20 years from now? Just any last thoughts for you today?
I would say, Charlie, Adelina, and Gemma, I love you with all my heart and proud of who you are. And I just am excited every day to see what you're going to say, what you're going to learn. And there's nothing like being a father. It's the best.
Awesome. Well, thank you again for coming on our show today, Eric. And as I always say to wrap up the show, live your best life, be radically generous, a great big booyah to ya. And this has been a one-on-one sit down with Eric Wynn of Wynn Vintage Watches, but we're just getting started. Booyah.
Booyah.
Okay.
The opinions expressed in this program are for general information purposes only and are not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual or any specific security. It's only intended to provide education about the financial industry. To determine which investments may be appropriate for you, consult your financial advisor prior to investing. Any past performance discussed during this program is no guarantee of future results. Any indices referenced for comparison are unmanaged and cannot be invested into directly. As always, please remember investing involves risks and possible loss of principal capital. Please seek advice from a licensed professional.